Hello and welcome to the LandKit Topo workflow, where we'll be learning a little bit about how to create and manipulate our topography in our 3D modeling software using LandKit's Topo modeling tools. You'll notice that we have Grasshopper minimized down here in the corner, and even though these tools work within Grasshopper, we've developed this lovely panel here that will allow you to control and manipulate this geometry in the 3D modeling space using your layers and using this workflow panel so that you can model out your entire topography using these powerful tools without having to know anything about Grasshopper. You'll notice that we can see these updates to our topography live while we're working very quickly and efficiently, with regrading happening while we're working as well, and even the ability to adjust our features, our landscape features, in order to see the changes in the topography also. We can shift these different elements up and down and see how the mesh is being created underneath, and the contours are generating the representation of our grading on top of it. We have a couple different representations of the types of features here, such as a path being graded up this hillside, a set of stairs being generated using a surface, walls being generated using simple spot elevations for the top back and the bottom front of the wall, in line with our curves that represent the front and back of the wall in plan, and then our curbs as well, which allow us to do the same thing as walls but in a much smaller scale and utilizing things like curb cuts. So let's talk a little bit about our panel here and our layer structure and how these things come together. So you'll notice that we have a specific set of names here for these layers, and these layers are named in order to relate to the workflow panel through the Grasshopper component. So all you need to worry about is making sure that when you create your geometry and manipulate it, that it's being sorted and placed in appropriate layers that are going to change the topography how you're wanting to. So for instance, we have under our proposed layer here some topographic layers. So in this case, under topography, we have a series of layers that could be joined together in what's called a geoset. And if you look at the workflow panel, you'll notice that there is a button called Refresh Geoset. So anytime we change any of, or add, or take away, or modify any of the geometry in these layers under topography for existing or proposed, we are actually going to need to hit this Refresh Geoset button to see those updates happen. So if I were to move this curve over and shift it up in order to create some sort of wacky mound in the middle of this plaza, you'll notice that it's not updating immediately, but once I hit the Refresh Geoset button, it's going to reprocess and update the topography to reflect how that curve is just generating a mound in the middle of that little plaza area. I'm not too fond of this mound, so I'm going to go back and refresh my geoset again to return my topography back to where it was. So any of the geometry that you place in these layers will need to be refreshed using the Refresh Geoset button anytime you update. So it allows you to make a lot of changes, modify a bunch of stuff, hit the refresh button, and see that update happen readily. Another thing you'll notice here is that we have layers specifically for features and mods. And features and mods will update automatically. You saw a little bit of that at the very beginning, where when I was moving around these mounds, the curves that are creating the mounds. In this case, this is a mod that allows us to create a mound using a 3D object, which is called the grading tools. So if I open this up in the mod, you'll see we have some graded geometry here, and that's these two curves that we're actually using three-dimensional geometry to create different types of forms in the landscape. So the updates are happening automatically for the mods and the features. You don't need to worry about hitting a refresh button for these. And you'll see also inside of the features, we have different layers for different types of features. In this case, we have layers for curbs. We have layers for paths that are being graded up these hills. We have layers for stairs as well. And we have layers for walls. And sorting your different geometry in these different layers is how you're going to get these features to be represented and grade in your landscape. But these things, again, automatically update. So if I were to move this point that represents the top back of my wall at this location, you'll see it will automatically update and regrade my site according to those changes. Okay, so how do we adjust these things after we have the geometry in? So for instance, we have this mound here. This mound looks a specific way, but how do we change the way this mound looks just using the different parameters that we have available to us and not just the geometry? Because moving around the geometry is not necessarily going to change the slope angle of this, or the path is not going to be, the width of the path is not adjustable just by using the center line curve and the spot elevation to represent the beginning of the elevation of the path. So how do we change around these parameters? So under the panel, we have our info tab, but we also have, that gives a little information about how these things work, this panel works, but we also have the existing and proposed tab. And the existing and proposed tab are pretty much identical with the exception of the naming within the tabs. And these come underneath of them 2 tabs for features and mods. And under each of those are a set of parameters that we can adjust to change how these different elements that we're creating with the geometry are looking and being represented. So I don't really like where this path is falling at this elevation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase the path slope to 8.33 and create a path that generates a flatter landing here at the top. And you can see now the path hits at a flatter landing at the top where these mounds are being represented. So the ability to adjust these things is done using the different parameters in here. And you can see we have different parameters for each of the different types of geometry and features that we're working with in this. Same thing with the mounds here that we have. So if we jump over to the proposed, which is what these curves are under, these are under the grade geometry mod proposed category. And if we look at our mods here and we look at the grading geometry, so these are under grade 1 here, and we can see that we actually have parameters for the offset and the slope. So if I go in here and I change the offset, and you can see that by double clicking the little gray line here, we can actually type in a value that we want instead of sliding these around, which can take a little bit more time to process. I hit enter. You can see that the ridge of these mounds are changing to be a little bit thinner, not quite as thick as they were before. So instead of being sort of a 1.5 foot walking path up and down these mounds, now we just have sort of a ridge line that follows that edge. But maybe we like that there's a little path there along the top of these mounds. So I can change that back to a 1.5 offset. And what it's doing is it's finding the geometry that we're using, it's offsetting that value, and then grading away from there in the 3-dimensional space. That's the reason why whenever I shift these around, it will automatically update according to those parameters, because it's utilizing the geometry in its 3-dimensional space to grade the topography. We can also change the slopes of the sides of these mounds. So if I were to come in here and change this from a 40% slope to maybe, let's say, a 90% slope, we can see that these mounds become a lot steeper on the sides, and we can see how that's happening live while we're working. And again, every time we adjust these mounds, it maintains that offset and that slope for you. So these parameters give you a lot of control over how the different pieces of geometry are representing themselves on the site. So that covers most of what these different tabs do, and exploring these a little bit and understanding how the different walls and curbs and paths work is something that you can learn a little bit more on the website as well. But let's jump over to the Out tab, and let's talk about what our outputs are, and then let's also talk about what some of these other buttons at the top do. So while we're working, especially with features, for instance, since features and mods update live while we're working, sometimes we might want to adjust a bunch of features before seeing those updates happen so that we're not seeing a lot of processing happening while we're working. The play pause button can be quite useful in this case. So the ability to turn off the entire script, make as many changes as you want, turn it back on, and then see those updates happen while you're working. It's a little bit easier with the geoset and the geometry to just hit the button and refresh things, but for the features and mods, sometimes that play pause button can be quite handy. Another thing that you'll notice here is a toggle for the proposed and existing topography. So if we look at the geometry that we're using for our proposed site, you can see that we actually generated a boundary around where our proposed geometry will be. So none of the existing geometry is being applied in here. And if you look at it, we actually have some break lines and contours here that are generating existing topography. But because that geometry falls within the proposed boundary, it's being excluded from the processing of the model. But if we toggle off this button, we can actually visualize what that existing versus the proposed looks like. So you can actually see where those existing break lines are generating that hillside. And then when we toggle it back on, you can see where the boundary of our proposed site is interacting seamlessly with our existing topography in order to generate a single continuous mesh for all of our proposed and existing together. So let's toggle that off. The next set of buttons you'll see here is the ability to bake things out. And this is nice because simply by clicking these buttons, it places the geometry from Rhino, from the Grasshopper into the Rhino space. So I click this button and you'll see that now I have a single continuous mesh that is representative of all of the modeling that I've done. You'll notice though that all of the grading where the features were does not include any of the features. And that's because we have a button here separate for the features so that we can bake those out and have those represent the landscape separately. So the ability to have these two things separate is quite handy at times to be able to apply different materials to them and so on and so forth. But it's also useful because having a single continuous mesh allows us to produce analysis. And that's where some of these analysis preview options come into play. So if we go down here, we can see that once we hit the bake button, it actually generated automatically layers for us that we can use for our representation of our site. So we have our materials layer, which is where our features are going. We have our mesh, which is just our single continuous 10. And then we also have our contours that bake out as well. And we can export those and clean those up to create a grading plan if we'd like. So let's toggle those off for now, and let's talk a little bit about other preview options that we have available to us. The first that you see that we have is just a simple mesh, but we can also switch that to none if we want to kind of preview these contours a little bit more readily. But we also have the ability to see some of these analysis options live while we're working as well. So in this case, we have the elevation layer, which allows us to see a lighter to darker elevation. So light means higher, dark means lower. So we can see that elevation change throughout. We can switch to the slope preview, which allows us to see the different slope values on our site while we're working. So you can actually now visualize those slope values that we've input directly into these modification. And so if I were to adjust this wall here, you can see it's going to adjust our topography and automatically update our slope analysis preview. So there's a lot of benefit to being able to see those slopes live, and then also having a legend here that indicates what the different slope values mean by their percentages. So we can see the color relationship between a 0 to 2% slope here in this almost white color. And then as we go from whitish beige onto these darker browns through the oranges, we can see the different values and categories of slopes that are available to us. Another one that is quite wonderful to look at is the cut fill, which allows us to actually calculate our cut fill values. And you can see our cut volume in cubic feet and fill volume in cubic feet down here. We can adjust some parameters to this in order to create more or less detail. So in this case, our cell size, the lower that is, the more detail we're going to get to our mesh and the more accuracy to our cut fill volumes. So you can see by decreasing that down to 1, we get a much more comprehensive representation of our site. And we also get slightly more detailed and accurate cut and fill volume. So if I increase that up to 5, you'll see that the grid of points that are being used to generate our cut fill is now spaced at 5 feet by 5 feet. So it's a little bit less detailed. The resolution is lower with a higher cell size, and we get a higher resolution with a lower cell size. Another thing that's kind of handy here is the ability to visualize that cut fill using the visualization depth or the viz depth. So here you can see our legend on the side is showing us that between 0 and 9 feet of fill coloring and 0 and 9 feet of cut coloring. So if we look at this, we're probably only getting about maybe like 3 or 4 feet of cut and probably only about maybe at most a 3 or 4 feet of fill. So if we actually take this value and decrease it down to, let's say, 5, we're going to get a much better representation of that coloration difference by saying that our range of depths are only from 0 to 4, not from 0 to 10. So we're getting a little bit more accuracy in that visualization. The other elements here before we jump into areas that are important to pay attention to are the ability to preview on and off our contours. So I'm going to switch back over to the mesh preview here. Our contours, we can actually preview those on and off, and we can change the value of those contour cuts. So we can do 1 foot contours or half foot contours or whatever we want. We can also preview flow lines while we're working and see our water flowing across our site while we're changing our topography around. So if I were to change this mound to a depression, we will see the update of our topography as well as the update of the flow lines flowing now into the depression that we've created instead of flowing away from the mound that we had before. The controls down here allow you to control how many lines that will be represented on our site, as well as the detail of the sites. And you can see that when we hover over top of these, we get some tooltips on what these different values mean. The next thing I want to talk about before we get into section cuts is the site size. And so here we have a drop-down menu that allows us to indicate the size of our site. This is important because the smaller the site size, the more detail you're going to get. And the larger your site size, the less detail you're going to get. If you're working on a site that is really small, keeping a small site size is really useful. But even if you increase that up to a medium site size, your software will process faster. So the larger the site, the faster the processing, but the less detail. The smaller the site, the slower the processing, but the more detail you get. So if you're working on a really large site, but you want to capture all of that little detail, maybe while you're modeling, you keep the site size at large, and you can see that the decrease in detail is starting to create some funky interactions between our features and our topography. And then maybe when you're ready to see that a little bit more detailed, you could drop it down to a medium or small. But we also have a little bit of an indication here of site sizes that might be relevant to your selection that you're using. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is areas, and section cuts and areas very much relate to each other. So we're going to toggle on our areas here, and we're going to talk about how we can utilize different projection capabilities of the software in order to visualize and see these materials on our site live while we're working. So I'm going to go back to our existing features and turn our preview for our path off. And you can see also that once we press the preview option for areas, we get a few selections here available to us that pop up. The first here is the Collage tool, and the Collage tool is great because if we go down here and we turn on our areas, you can see that all of our areas are elevated in 3D space at different elevations. If we look in plan view, our areas are actually perfectly associated with the different areas on our site. So looking at it in plan view here matches up with our plan view that we're seeing down there. So it actually gives us a little bit of a control over being able to see what our collage is doing. But how the collage actually works is by giving precedent to some surfaces over others based on their elevation in space. So for instance, if I wanted this concrete little plaza path here to be just lawn, I could delete this surface, but I could also just take this surface and lower it in the Z-plane below this larger lawn space, and you can see it disappears because everything that's above will take precedent over anything that's below. So it allows us to do this fun collaging action where we can just shift around these surfaces or change the surface shapes or cut them and then have them cut out from each other automatically. So these will all mash down together when we bake these out. So if we go up here and hit the bake button, if we hit bake now, these are going to bake into our materials layers, and they're also going to be separated by their different material layers as well. So all of our lawns will be their own individual meshes. They all relate as the same material to each other, and everything meets at this nice seam where they're touching each other perfectly. So you can see even down here, these white lines that we have represented on our site are actually being cut out of the asphalt there. And if we want to see those changes happen because maybe we don't like the location of these white lines, we can shift them over. We can see it process and update. We can hit bake again and see that automatically delete out the previous example and update to the new option that we have available to us from our changes. Same thing with changing the topography with our features and so on and so forth. We change it, have it process, hit bake, automatically updates for us and changes that geometry. And you can see that when we extend our materials layers, they're all organized into their specific layers. So if I wanted to grab all of the lawn layers, hit select objects, and there's all of my lawns. So there's a couple other fun things in here that we can look at as well. Ability to bake hatches instead of meshes. The collage tool, we could use the collage tool in the way that we're seeing here, or if we toggle that off, we could actually just split each of these surfaces out from each other and have them all on the exact same plane. Another thing that's quite useful is the ability to toggle on your material surface areas and see the square footage of each of the different materials that you're using on your site. Another thing that's quite nice that we have here is the ability to visualize and bake out line work. So these different line work style options allow you to visualize or bake out adjacencies or boundaries or things of that sort. Another thing that you're seeing here is the ability to utilize the area clip, which is down here under this layer, and we can actually clip our areas after the fact by using this boundary and adjusting it to see how the clipping is happening live while we're working. So if we don't want any clipping, we can simply grab this curve and delete it out. And now we are only seeing the full representation of all of our areas as the surfaces that we have in here. The very last thing that I really wanted to showcase is these section cuts. And the section cuts are super fun because it allows us to visualize our section cuts live while we're working. So you can see that they're also adhering to the different materials. They're adhering to the features that we're including, so we can include or remove our features from our preview of our area, of our section cuts. We can bake these out and it will organize these different area lines into specific layers for us so that we can transfer this into a Illustrator document or a CAD document and start to create more illustrative sections for our site. But the nice part is that since all of this is happening live while we're working, every time we adjust these section cut lines around, we're seeing the updates to that live while we're moving it. The nice part too is that we can actually create and copy these and create a bunch of serial sections very quickly and efficiently. And we can move all of these around however we want. So if we want to see that interaction and section cut, serial section cut from the plaza to these mounds, we can see that happening from 3 to 6. And you can see that these are numbered nicely for us. So I can shift these around and see that happening. The other cool thing is that these section cuts also update live while we're changing our geometry. So if I were to come in here and have a section line that's going through our mound here, and let's say I were to change that mound's height from a depression to a mound itself, if we look at the depression here that we have here, the little basin, I shift this up and you can see that live update while we're working. So the section cuts interact in the same way that the topography interacts, so we can see everything happening and updating while we're working so that we can respond to it and make adjustments as needed. So that covers the main features and how to utilize this workflow, and really understanding how this workflow works and how to use and organize your geometry in these different layers will take you a really long way in being able to utilize these workflows without having to worry about knowing anything with Grasshopper. So enjoy the workflow, and if you have any questions or concerns, please contact us and feel free to visit our website to explore more educational materials and check out our office hours if you're running into some bugs, and get some free help on a Zoom call on any of our available times during the week.